Welcome back everybody, my name is Tucker, and in today's video we're going to be looking back at some NBA draft class grades from the 2016 NBA draft. I just did this less than a week ago with the 2017 NBA draft. You guys really enjoyed the video, did super well, so of course I'm going to do another one, this time with a 2016 class. But really quickly before we get started, if you're not already, I do have a second channel that you can subscribe to called Gaming Logically, and I'm going to be streaming some Warzone over there today. I know a good amount of you have already subbed and have seen some content over there, but if you're interested, I'm going to be playing some Warzone, hanging out over there. I do have a handful of wins, and I'm just going to be hanging out, having fun. So if you're watching this the day that this video comes out, I will be streaming over there later, so go check it out. Okay, here we go, pick by pick, beginning with number 1 overall, Ben Simmons out of LSU. Bleacher Report gave this an A. And right now, I don't really see how you can give it anything other than an A, A-, A+, somewhere in that range. Obviously, there's a lot of good players in this draft class, but at the time, Ben Simmons was the correct pick, and I still think that he's the correct pick. Obviously, Brandon Ingram has had an outstanding season this year. Jaylen Brown's going to get paid a ton of money, but out of all those guys, the player that can potentially be like the number 1 option on a really good team, I think Ben Simmons is still that guy. Really, really good on both ends of the floor. So much is focused on his inability and his just complete lack of interest in developing a jump shot that it takes away from some of the stuff that he does really well. And I think in a different situation, we'd think a lot differently of Ben Simmons. So as a player right now, even though I still think that he needs to work on his jump shot a ton, I think this A grade is completely fair. Which brings us now to number 2 overall, the Los Angeles Lakers selecting Brandon Ingram, who of course is now with the Pelicans. They also gave this an A. And I mean, we did this with the Lonzo Ball one too in the 2017 draft. It's kind of like up in the air really, because they ended up being moved to the Pelicans, and now both of those players are playing better in New Orleans than they did with the Lakers. But from a talent standpoint, getting Brandon Ingram at number 2 overall with an A, I think that's a fair grade. Moving on now to what I think is probably the most interesting pick to this point, number 3, Jaylen Brown. And we're going to compare it to the next 2 picks with the Suns and Dragan Bender and the Timberwolves with Chris Dunn, both getting a higher grade than the B- that Bleacher Report gave the Celtics for Jaylen Brown. And essentially they saw this as a high-risk pick because Brown is an underdeveloped shooter and Boston needs some threats from the outside. And that absolutely was true, but they've done a great job of developing him into a really, really good two-way wing, a borderline all-star caliber wing in Boston, and certainly a much better player than either of the 2 players that come after him here. The first one being Dragan Bender, number 4 overall to the Suns with a B. It says another high-risk, high-reward selection, similar to the Marquise Chris thing. And neither of these guys really had any kind of impact on the Suns as an organization. And Bender is now with the Warriors, I believe, as is Chris. So, I mean, it never worked out for him. The stretch big shooter thing always seems to come out of Europe, and everybody gets excited about a handful of players every single time in every single draft class, and it's really only worked out a couple of times, and Bender was not one of the times that it worked out. I mean, this has to be an F grade at this point. This is definitely the worst pick of the lot to this point. I mean, for a guy that had such little impact at number 4 overall, I think this has to be an F. Now, then you get to the Minnesota Timberwolves, Chris Dunn with a B+ at number 5 overall. I've never really been on the Chris Dunn hype train. I understand what he does defensively, but offensively, he was never good enough off the ball to really be on the floor a ton. And on the ball, he's okay as a playmaker, but not good enough to take touches away from other players that are simply better on the ball. So even as good as he can be defensively, I just didn't really see it, right? And for the Timberwolves, obviously, they got value out of him. He was involved in the Jimmy Butler trade, and then they got Covington and Saric, and then you can continue to follow that strand on down the road. But as a player, as a number 5 overall pick right now for Chris Dunn, I would give this like a C- type grade, because I don't think that he's anything more than like a backup point guard rotation piece at this point in his career. Moving on now to number 6, the New Orleans Pelicans selecting Buddy Hield. And the interesting thing to this point is that like a lot of these guys ended up being traded. I mean, Ben Simmons and Jaylen Brown are still there, but Brandon Ingram, Dragan Bender, both not on their original teams. Chris Dunn got traded, and then Buddy Hield, of course, was moved as well. For the New Orleans Pelicans, they gave him an A-, and it's interesting, right? Because he's a really productive, really good player now for Sacramento. Someone they got in exchange for DeMarcus Cousins in a trade. But now he's a bench option and he's going to be really expensive. Very, very good player. Great shooter. One of the best shooters in the league. I think this A- grade is fair, but moving forward, it's going to be interesting to watch the arc of his career because he is an older guy in terms of when he was drafted, and now he's getting pretty expensive as well. Brings us now to number 7, Jamal Murray. They gave him an A. I think that's a fair grade as well. He's someone that is going to continue to develop, still very, very young, good scorer, good playmaker. maybe isn't going to be good enough to be the number 2 option on a Denver team if they really want to be like a championship type team. But as value at number 7 overall, someone that is this young, someone that has this much potential, someone that can score and play make at this level, I think the A for Jamal Murray at number 7 is definitely a good grade. Which brings us now to number 8, the Phoenix Suns. Once again, this pick from Sacramento, they gave this a B for Marquise Chris, and similar to Dragan Bender, this has to be an F, right? Like when anytime you have 2 top 10 picks in the same draft class and both of them are off the team before their rookie contracts are up, that tells you everything you need to know, right? And they just didn't get good value. They didn't develop these players properly. Wouldn't be surprised if they had some success on other teams moving forward in their careers, but in Phoenix, it did not work out. Moving on now to number 9, I had honestly forgotten that Jakob Poeltl was picked this high. I, for some reason, thought that he was like a late first round pick. No, he's the number 9 overall pick for the Toronto Raptors as an A-. And he's a solid rotation big, especially as a two-way player, but not someone that is worthy of the number 9 overall pick. So I would give this a C. Obviously, he ended up becoming a piece in the Kawhi Leonard trade, but just as value for the number 9 overall pick, especially considering some of the players, especially in the front court that are going to be coming up later in this draft class, not a great pick for Toronto here. Moving on now to Thon Maker at number 10. This grade, I think, is absolutely fair. They gave the Bucks a D. So at the time, Thon Maker was one of this high upside players that showed a lot of different things. I remember seeing this guy in high school a couple of times one time in person at a big tournament here in North Carolina, and was a typical big guy in high school that wanted to work on everything other than being a big guy and had some skills, but didn't necessarily have perimeter skills to the level of a guy that you actually want to handle the ball or shoot from the outside as a big, and just never developed, never got big enough. Still continues to get chances throughout the league and eventually forced his way out of Milwaukee via a trade. But this grade of a D is certainly, I think, accurate for this point in time. Moving on now to number 11 overall, the Oklahoma City Thunder, Domantas Sabonis. They gave this a B+. And obviously this ended up being an interesting scenario because him and Oladipo ended up going to the Pacers in exchange for Paul George. And in Sabonis' first year, he was basically just asked to shoot from the outside, which he did admirably. But now in Indiana, he's an all-star caliber player, one of the better inside scorers in the league, and a really important piece for that Pacers team. And I think arguably, especially when you're considering guys like Thon Maker and Chris and Bender and Poeltl being picked ahead of him, I think you could say that this was, an A and maybe even an A+, given that he is now an all-star caliber player for the Pacers. Obviously, the Thunder didn't end up keeping him, so it's not necessarily an A or A+ for the Thunder, but maybe more for the trade for the Pacers to get Sabonis. But a really good pick there. Number 12 now, the Utah Jazz selecting Taurean Prince, who ended up in Atlanta. I'll have to check and see later on how that all went down. They gave that a C, and this is kind of tough because I do think that Taurean Prince is a good player, and for value here at number 12 overall, especially when you're considering some of the guys that he was picked, ahead of, it certainly looks like the right pick. I would give this more of a B than a C, and I think he's someone that can continue to develop moving forward as a perimeter player, a two-way player, guy that can defend and can shoot. Not that he's great at those things right now, but I think he has that in him to be a nice two-way player. Moving on now to number 13 overall, the Sacramento Kings. This is an era in which they just continued to select big guys for whatever reason. And at number 13 overall, they got Georgios. I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce his last name, but I know that he didn't last very long in the league. I know that it was really, really weird at the time because they still had DeMarcus Cousins. They hadn't made the Buddy Hield trade yet. And C, as a grade, is probably not harsh enough. This is probably a D or a D- or maybe even an F for a guy that really did not impact their team whatsoever as a lottery pick. And then we get to number 14 overall, the Chicago Bulls selecting Denzel Valentine as a C+. I think that's about fair. Once you get to this point in the draft, mid-first round, you can find some really, really good players, but a lot of times guys are just going to kind of wash out, get some minutes in the rotation like Valentine has, but doesn't necessarily look like a huge future piece for this team. I think a C+ is probably accurate. Number 15 now for the Denver Nuggets, Juan Hernangomez, who is now with the Timberwolves via the Malik Beasley, Clint Capella, everybody in the Western Conference being traded at once trade. They gave this a B+. I still think that he's good, especially as a shooter. Maybe you give this a B because he hasn't, proven to be a strong rotation piece for Denver to the point that they ended up moving him in a trade. But I think as a player, I would still give this kind of like a B or a B+. Moving on now to number 16 overall, the Boston Celtics, Gershon Yabusele, who I don't believe is on the team anymore and had some moments, but nothing really, really impactful. I think a C+, C+ is pretty accurate here. Other pieces here picks, that could end up being significant. Karis LeVert here at number 20 overall, they gave a C-. This is a guy that I still think has the talent to be a really good player, maybe not ever become an all-star, but if he stays healthy, I think that he has the opportunity to at least be a really good scoring guard in the NBA. So that pick for me is definitely better than a C-. Number 19 overall, the Denver Nuggets, now with the Minnesota Timberwolves, Malik Beasley, a B. I would think that in terms of value at 19 overall, getting someone that right now, up until the stoppage of the NBA, was averaging around 20 points per game with the Timberwolves, someone with that level of scoring upside, I think you got to give this more of a B+ when you're getting guys like that at number 19 overall. Interesting ones here later on. They gave the Sacramento Kings an A- for Malachi Richardson out of Syracuse, who never did anything for the Kings nor any other team. Luwawu Cabarro, I know, is still on the Nets. They gave the Sixers an A- there, has never really found his place. Furkan Korkmaz, A-. I think you could say that is a fair grade for him. Someone that is going to continue to develop, can shoot the ball, and is kind of now coming into his own as someone that was a pretty young draft pick at the time. But here is a really, really interesting one. Number 27 overall, Pascal Siakam out of New Mexico State, a B grade. Here's what it says. With Bismack Biyombo potentially on his way out, Toronto took a similar player who could help right away. Siakam will not become more than a role player, but he should have a nice career. So a couple of things here. Now, I'm not going to bash Bleacher Report too much for this, right? Because nobody thought Pascal Siakam was going to become like an all-NBA caliber forward, right? But they compared him to a Bismack Biyombo type player, and they said he would never become more than a role player. And I will admit, like, when Pascal Siakam first came in the league and you watched him, you're like, okay, he's an energy and effort guy. There's not a ton of skill there. He's going to work inside, and that's going to be about it. But his ability to continue to improve and become such a good perimeter player has been completely unforeseen by anybody. You have to give this a B+. Potentially one of the best players in the entire class at number 27 overall. Beyond that, DeJounte Murray at 29, we kind of all knew that was going to be a solid pick for the Spurs. TBD on that to see how much, he really grows long term. Malcolm Brogdon, number 36 overall, gets a B. I think you could easily say that's an A+. He ended up winning a Rookie of the Year this year. Other than that, I don't see anybody really of note in terms of what they did in the NBA in the rest of this class. So it pretty much stops with, where did he go? Pretty much stops, Patrick McCall is there, but pretty much stops with Malcolm Brogdon. So a pretty interesting class here, and obviously the most noteworthy ones being Siakam at 27 later on, but not the strongest class, but the first couple of guys, Ben Simmons, Brandon Ingram, Jaylen Brown, certainly prop up this class, and then you've got Siakam in there as well, and Sabonis. So a handful of all-stars, probably not any MVPs in this class, but a handful of really, really good players. So that is going to be the end of today's video. I hope you all enjoyed it, looking back at the 2016 NBA Draft. Once again, my name is Tucker. If you missed any of my previous videos, then be sure to check out the boxes on screen. Thanks again, and I'll see you all next time.